Among the people arrested, alleged associates of the HELLS Angels, Sonoma County.
From running the streets to being thrown into the slammer, the HELLS Angels are on law enforcement agencies' radar. And when they get their hands on them, they make sure to make them pay. Here are some of the most notorious members of the outlaw biker gang who've received life sentences and their reactions at the sentencing. Starting with a triple whammy, 3 HELLS Angels members serving a life term for the same case. One of the doctrines of the HELLS Angels is that you always stand by your own, but Joel Silva was a notable exception. The year is 2014, and Silva had fallen out of favor with his brothers. Apparently, Silva's drug habit had gotten out of control. He was acting increasingly erratically and was altogether becoming a liability for the Sonoma County chapter of the outlaw biker gang. That being said, Silva was a sergeant-at-arms for the HELLS Angels. In simpler terms, he acted as the muscle for the Sonoma County chapter. Even though he'd become a problem for the HELLS Angels, they knew that it'd be difficult to get rid of him. That was something that encouraged Silva to take more drastic measures. This included disrespecting senior members of the Boston chapter of the HELLS Angels and frequently getting into fights with members of his own Sonoma County club. Things finally came to a head when Silva threatened to take over Jonathan Nelson's role as the Sonoma County chapter's leader. In the end, it was a unanimous decision to eliminate him. There are a few things worth noting about the HELLS Angels operations. 1, it takes a whole lot more than a motorbike to become a member, and 2, you're not allowed to just up and leave the club. While there have been notable cases where former members have found their way out, it's never without the threat of being unalived by their former brothers. Silva's case was particularly unique because he wasn't about to leave without a fight. This forced the Sonoma County members to do something that's otherwise unconventional for the outlaw gang, turning on one of their own. In July 2014, Silva was lured to the Fresno HELLS Angels clubhouse of the biker gang by Russell Otto. He was told that other members, some of whom were from the Fresno chapter and mostly from the Sonoma chapter, were willing to work out their differences with Silva. However, once Silva was caught off guard, he was fatally shot in the back of the head by Fresno chapter president Brian Wendt. This was a corroborated effort, orchestrated by several members of the HELLS Angels. If they weren't actively involved in the crime, they'd at least conspired against Silva in one way or another. That's why the prosecutors were sure to charge every one of them. But there was more to one former member's case, Merle Hefferman. The 54-year-old was a former member of the Fresno County chapter who'd effectively retired from day-to-day operations but was still actively involved at the clubhouse. On this particular occasion in July 2014, he was called again for his services. Hefferman had a contact, Levi Phipps, who owned and operated the Yost and Webb Funeral Home in Fresno. Allegedly, on the day of Silva's unaliving, Hefferman had contacted Phipps, instructing him to leave the hangar door open. Phipps claimed that he wasn't well acquainted with Hefferman at all and denied that he was a co-conspirator. If anything, he alleged that he was a victim in the whole ordeal too. Phipps claimed that after receiving the call, Hefferman showed up at the funeral home post-midnight, threatened him with a gun, and placed a body in the cremation chamber. Phipps claimed that he wasn't sure who it was, and prosecutors allege that the timeline matches up to the night of Silva's murder. Prosecutors claimed that Hefferman would later use Phipps' funeral home as his personal pizza oven. Prosecutors also claimed that Hefferman returned to the funeral home 3 more times to dispose of 3 more bodies. A few months after Silva's unaliving, Hefferman contacted Phipps to arrange another cremation. This time it was that of Robbie Huff, a former member of the HELLS Angels who'd gone missing in 2015. Interestingly enough, Huff had been a person of interest in Silva's case as well. Then, in 2016, Phipps was contacted again. This time, Hefferman was allegedly disposing of the body of Art Karasis, also a member of the HELLS Angels who'd gone missing a few months prior to the cremation. The prosecution did not name the 4th alleged victim, though Hefferman's attorney, James Bustamante, identified him as HELLS Angels member Juan Guevara. Besides Phipps's testimony and phone records, Hefferman's attorneys admitted to some of the crimes, hoping it would give their clients some leverage. It worked. Prosecutors ultimately decided not to charge Hefferman with the 3 disposals that came after Silva. That being said, they went against Hefferman and all of his co-conspirators with everything they had. By 2022, Brian Wendt, Jonathan Nelson, and Russell Ott were convicted of Silva's murder and related racketeering charges. As far as Hefferman was concerned, prosecutors worked out a deal with his attorneys, giving him a light sentence in exchange for information on the inner workings of the Fresno chapter of the biker gang. Hefferman was ultimately sentenced to only 4 years for his role in obstructing justice. Nelson, Wendt, and Otto received life sentences without the possibility of parole after an extensive 9-week trial. The other Hells Angels members who conspired in Silva's unaliving received a minimum of 4 or up to 7 years in prison. Prosecutors noted that Silva's unaliving would have gone under the radar had it not been for the FBI's extensive operation against the Sonoma and Fresno County chapters for racketeering, extortion, and a slew of other crimes. The FBI had begun its crackdown on the outlaw group in 2017, capturing several members, 3 of whom won't be seeing the light of day anytime soon. Next up is a son who followed his father's footsteps, first into the Hells Angels and then right into prison.
Joseph Soto Sr., Joseph Soto Jr., and John Seeger were held to answer Thursday on charges of robbery, assault with a gun, false imprisonment, and participating in a street gang. They have an arraignment date set for September. According to sheriff's reports, the Hells Angels went to their former clubhouse 5 times from March 1st to April 11th. Prosecutors say they beat a man who lived there and held him at gunpoint as they stole several items.
The Hells Angels have a permanent file at every law agency's office. The notorious biker gang has been accused of using their strength, both muscle, weaponry, and in numbers, to intimidate and terrorize members of the public. The California chapter of the group in particular had been raising havoc for several years. Ultimately, a 2024 raid busted every member of the California chapter. 2 members could be facing a life sentence. Over 100 law officials from 6 departments, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, Kern County Sheriff's Office, and the California Highway Patrol swarmed 8 locations or clubhouses of the Hells Angels California chapter, arresting several members, including father-son duo Joseph Soto Sr. and Joseph Soto Jr. Altogether, law officers arrested 6 individuals and seized more than 24 guns, ammunition, multiple high-capacity magazines, and gang affiliate paraphernalia. A 7th member, Joshua Vaughn, was already in custody on other charges. Soto Sr. and Soto Jr. were high-ranking members of the Bakersfield chapter who would routinely collude with the Sons of Hell motorcycle gang, a sub-affiliate of the outlaw group. All 7 of the suspects were charged with kidnapping, first-degree robbery, making criminal threats, false imprisonment, assault with a firearm, participation in a criminal street gang, criminal conspiracy, intimidating a witness or victim, and elder abuse. In the months following the arrests, preliminary hearings were conducted to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. In September 2024, a Kern County judge ordered that 3 of the accused, Soto Sr., Soto Jr., and John Seeger, stand trial. Allegedly, the 3 had broken into a home in Bakersfield, threatened the elderly homeowner with a gun, assaulted him, and robbed him. Their case is ongoing as of February 2025, with experts claiming that Kern County could be looking to make an example out of the Hells Angels members. This could mean a possible life sentence for the Bakersfield members involved in the assault and robbery. On a larger scale, prosecutors are hoping to shut down the entire California chapter of the gang. The Hells Angels have expanded their operations beyond North America, and for this next case, we're looking at a member of a European president of the Hells Angels who might just be more dangerous than any other biker on the planet. Kadir Padir.
Türke Kadir Padir den Mord befehligt haben. Der Ex-Boxer und Anführer der Westberliner Hells Angels rekrutiert vor allem gewaltbereite Jugendliche mit Migrationshintergrund. Von den mutmaßlichen Mordplänen der Gang wusste die Polizei schon lange.
Law officials in Berlin are a little too familiar with Kadir Padir, who goes by Kadir P. Over the years, this notorious member of the Berlin chapter of the Hells Angels has been involved in a variety of crimes. The one that finally saw him being locked up for good was the unaliving of Tahir Ozbek. While Kadir had always been a rebel biker, you'd be surprised to know that up until the 2010s, He was actively fighting the Hells Angels. This isn't to confuse him for being one of the good guys, simply the fact that he was a part of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, a rival organization of the Hells Angels. In fact, Kadir first gained prominence as a force in the outlaw biker community when he and an associate strong-armed two Hells Angels members in 2008. This incident highlighted the violent turf wars between these motorcycle clubs in Germany. Ultimately, under Kadir's leadership, the Hells Angels would see to it that Kadir's former organization was effectively wiped out of Berlin. Some things go without saying. You never cross paths with a member of the Hells Angels. However, Ozbek, a member of a rival motorcycle gang, decided to test his luck. In the months leading up to his unaliving, Ozbek had reportedly been in several altercations with members of the Berlin chapter. He'd already been on Kadir's radar because of his rival affiliations, and now it was clear that the Hells Angels wanted him eliminated. Ozbek's assassination was swift. In less than 25 seconds, he was cornered at a bookstore in Reinickendorf district, where he was fatally shot over half a dozen times. One bullet would have been enough to end his life, but Kadir P. wanted to make an example of Ozbek, and he did. Interestingly, Kadir wasn't coy about the attack. Surveillance footage captured him and his associates as they made their way toward Ozbek. Not only that, but he was also on record threatening Ozbek's life. You'd think that this would have been an open and shut case, but you'd be wrong. It took law enforcement agencies almost a year to apprehend Kadir and his associates. The issue was obvious here. No one wanted to testify against one of the most notorious criminals in Germany. But then prosecutors decided to try something else. They offered former members of the Berlin chapter or any of their known associates immunity in exchange for ironclad testimonies or evidence that would see Kadir and his associates in prison. That's how they managed to turn Kassara Z, a former associate, into a state witness. It was Kassara's testimony that provided prosecutors all the proof they needed. Kadir P. was arrested alongside 8 individuals accused of orchestrating the hit on Ozbek in November 2014. It was a sensational trial, and the judge ordered heightened security over fears of the Hells Angels members protesting Kadir's arrest. The prosecutors had more than enough evidence to lock up Kadir and throw away the key. But there were more challenges ahead. They needed to prove that Kadir was the one who had ordered the hit. If they managed to prove that this was a premeditated attack, they would be able to argue a life sentence for the Hells Angels members. It goes without saying that law officials in Berlin were working overtime to get Kadir P. locked up. In October 2019, after a long trial with twists and turns at every point, a Berlin district judge finally announced Kadir P.'s sentence: life behind bars. Altogether, 8 members of the Hells Angels were given a life sentence. Kadir was specifically convicted of incitement to murder, acknowledging his role in ordering the hit on Ozbek. This was a landmark court ruling in Germany. This was the first time that a member of the Hells Angels was sentenced to life imprisonment, underscoring just how dedicated law officials in Germany had become to eradicating outlaw biker groups in the country. A throwback for this next one, we're taking a look at one of Canadian Hells Angels' founding members, aka a most wanted criminal by the nation's police, Walter Stadnik. The Canadian chapter of the Hells Angels comes second only to the American founding chapter as the most violent outlaw biker gang in the world. And that's all thanks to Walter Stadnik, the club's third president who turned the Hells Angels into a budding biker gang in Canada to the force that it is today. But interestingly, there's not much information out there on Stadnik. Well, besides the fact that he's referred to as Nugget and stands at only 5'4". Another interesting fact here would be that Stadnik's going to be living out the rest of his days locked up. Why? Before we get into that, let's talk a little about the Hells Angels' most elusive member. Stadnik's rise to prominence as a member of the Hells Angels started out of spite. He was reportedly rejected from joining Satan's Choice, with the club claiming that he was too short to be a member. At the time, Stadnik had already formed his own motorcycle gang, the Cossacks. The group was dominated by many Ukrainian immigrant bikers, much like Stadnik. After being rejected by Satan's Choice, the biker decided to join Wild Ones. At the time, Satan's Choice had patched over to join the Outlaws, and Popeyes had patched over to join the Hells Angels. A turf war broke out between the Outlaws and the Hells Angels, with the wild ones largely being ignored in the crossfire. This gave Stadnik and his associates the opportunity to grow. Reportedly, the gang made their money by working as henchmen for the Canadian mafia. Investigators believed that Stadnik and his accomplices were responsible for the bombings of several businesses that refused to pay extortion money to the mafia. Again, because the greater issue was the turf war between the outlaws and the Hells Angels, Stadnik's criminal activities were largely ignored, giving him more space to grow as a seasoned outlaw. Eventually, the Wild Ones decided to patch over to the Hells Angels, in a move that saw their rivalry with the outlaws grow more than ever before. Throughout the years, that's from the 70s to the early 2000s, Stadnik operated first as a sergeant-in-arms and eventually became the Hells Angels Club president. This was a historic event for the Canadian chapter that was largely filled with French-Canadian bikers, and Stadnik would always have to have a translator present when meeting with members. Reporters believe that Stadnik was sworn in as the president when the Hells Angels was in decline. Of the 50 members, 19 were in prison, several dozens had already been unalived by the outlaws, and several more were in hiding. However, Stadnik was determined to bring the Hells Angels to its former glory, and he did just that. Stadnik's plan was to make the Hells Angels the strongest biker gang in Canada. Unfortunately, this meant amping efforts to terrorize the public through robberies, extortion, racketeering, and dire consequences for anyone who didn't comply with the Hells Angels. After decades of operating without any recourse, law officials began Operation Springtime in 2001. This was a crackdown by the Crown in an effort to bring down the Hells Angels, or specifically Stadnik. They had already been looking at the club's president for over a dozen unalivings. Stadnik was eventually apprehended after Danny Kane, a police informant, turned over evidence that sealed the deal for prosecutors. Despite being an open and shut case, Stadnik's defense attorneys argued that it was their client's constitutional right to have the whole trial conducted in English. For reference, it would have cost the Crown well over $23 million to have all 500,000 documents translated from French to English. These, according to the prosecutors, were delaying tactics employed by Stadnik and his team to keep their client a free man. While their plan worked somewhat in delaying the trial till 2004, a judge eventually found Stadnik guilty and sentenced him to 20 years behind bars. But not for the 13 unalivings. The judge claimed that the prosecutors had failed to present enough evidence that tied him to the incidents. However, there was more than enough evidence to suggest that under Stadnik's leadership, the Hells Angels had distributed several thousands of pounds of illegal substances around the greater Canadian region. Prosecutors claimed that Stadnik had become a millionaire, pocketing over $3 million because of the illegal drug trade. Keeping up with the fact that he led a very, very secretive life, Stadnik continued to maintain his residence at a local trailer park, all the while sitting on millions. Today, Stadnik might be a free man after an early parole. However, he's still being monitored by federal agents and is barred from making any contact with any outlaw group of any kind, much less the Hells Angels. You should never cross paths with a member of the Hells Angels, but in David Glasser's case, he was targeted at random by Adam Lee Hall. Not just once, but several times. Adam Lee Hall.
And Adam Hall did this. Not whether this is horrific or not.
But the DA went further, calling the murder and dismemberment vicious and cruel, and that the evidence pointed to no one other than Hall.
These were not just killings, ladies and gentlemen. They were depraved, hateful attacks that satisfied not just an intent to keep three men from testifying in court, but as satisfying some lust for retribution, an intent to take apart their community piece by piece.
In his closing statements, Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Kinder claimed that Adam Lee Hall's case was the worst kind of depravity he'd ever seen in his decades-long career of being a judge. But what exactly did the Hells Angels member do to deserve not one but 3 consecutive life sentences? Hall had been a high-ranking member of the Hells Angels Springfield chapter in Massachusetts. He had previously been arrested for assault before joining the outlaw gang, and ever since then had been on law enforcement's radar for coercing and intimidating witnesses of the Hells Angels' criminal activities. Simply, Hall was the muscle of the group. While he would be routinely sent in by higher-ups of the Hells Angels to threaten or intimidate several people in the greater Springfield area, It seemed like Hall had it out for one person in particular, David Glasser. Glasser was an intellectually disabled man who'd been living in an independent living facility alongside his friends, Edward Frampton and Robert Chadwell. After becoming a witness in one of the several cases against Hall, he'd become a target of the HELLS Angels. Only in Glasser's case, Hall took it upon himself to particularly harass Glasser. Besides assaulting and robbing him on several occasions, Hall openly threatened Glasser's life on more than a few occurrences. Glasser was offered police protection in the days leading up to the trial against Hall for possession and intimidation charges. However, before he could testify, Hall and a number of his associates swarmed Glasser's residence, kidnapped him, Frampton and Chadwell, and took them to a secluded area where they unalived them. Reportedly, Glasser was the target all along. Frampton and Chadwell were just unfortunate to have witnessed the kidnapping. Hall had ordered that they be kidnapped and eliminated just the same. This was back in 2011 after a member of the community had reported the 3 men missing. The victims' bodies were found in Beckett County nearly 2 weeks later, with Hall immediately becoming a person of interest in the crimes. Still, it would take law enforcement agencies another 2 years to formally charge Hall in connection with the crime. Glasser's unaliving served 2 purposes. 1, it was to quiet the witness, and 2, it was to send a message to anyone else who dared testify against Hall. This led to several people refusing to comply with law officials, delaying the case. Ultimately, after 2 long years of gathering evidence, corroborating with anyone who was brave enough to speak up, and tireless efforts, Springfield law officials had just enough to arrest Hall and his associates for the crimes. On that note, actually, one of the key pieces of evidence in Hall's case was his buddy, Roy Gutfinski's distinct appearance. Gutfinski, who goes by Caius Veavus, had several tattoos, piercings, and 2 horn-like projections emerging from the sides of his temple. A Home Depot employee claimed that Roy had entered the store on the day of the 3 men's kidnapping, inquiring about saws. Law officials believe that Roy was therefore instrumental in hurting the men's bodies after they'd been unalived by Hall. The investigation heavily relied on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of David Casey, an accessory to the crimes. Casey recounted how Hall detailed the gruesome acts, including shooting the victims. Despite the absence of direct forensic evidence linking Hall to the murders, no DNA or murder weapons were found. The prosecution built a compelling case based on the sequence of events and witness testimonies. The trial commenced on January 13, 2014, in Hampton Superior Court, Springfield. After 16 hours of deliberation over 4 days, the jury found Hall guilty on 15 of 19 charges, including 3 counts each of first-degree unaliving, kidnapping, and witness intimidation. On February 10, 2014, Judge Kinder sentenced Hall to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In his remarks, he highlighted the depravity of the crimes, noting that Hall preyed on vulnerable individuals. Additional sentences were imposed for related charges, ensuring Hall would serve an extra 25 to 42 years beyond his life terms, effectively ending his life while being locked up. If you're wondering how someone like Glasser, a man remarked for being friendly and staying away from trouble, get mixed with someone like Hall, someone who was quite the opposite, you wouldn't be the only one. Remember the case that Glasser was set to testify against Hall in. That was a case where he was both the chief witness and the victim. Because of Hall's association with the HELLS Angels, he seemed to have believed that he was invincible. One day, sometime in 2010, he targeted Glasser for no other reason besides that he seemed like easy prey. On that day, Glasser was assaulted by Hall, followed by Hall stealing his truck. Glasser reported the incident to the police, who returned his truck. Normally, this would have been enough for anyone who had the displeasure of interacting with Hall. He thoroughly believed that no one would ever go against him in court. But Glasser dared to be different. He not only filed charges against Hall, but was determined to see his conviction through. In retaliation, Hall began harassing and intimidating Glasser. On at least one occasion, he tried to have the intellectually challenged Glasser arrested for armed robbery. Despite everything, Glasser was determined to testify. In Hall's mind, there was only one way to keep that from happening. The other 2 men were nothing more than collateral damage. Victims' families burst into applause and embraced each other as Judge Kinder read out Hall's sentence. One of the victims' daughters claimed that she had grown increasingly angry as the trial kept on being delayed year after year. That, plus the fact that Hall showed no real emotion during the trial. If anything, he smirked through the whole thing. What was even more infuriating was that Hall's defense attorneys tried to plead leniency, claiming that despite a 90s conviction for assault, Hall had only ever been arrested for traffic violations. They tried to argue that he was not a threat to public security. The judge didn't agree. As for Hall's accomplices, they didn't receive life sentences but faced the maximum punishment of up to 40 years because of their involvement in the triple homicide. In Roy's court appearance, he threatened the judge, members of the jury, and everyone in the courtroom when he was being sentenced. Roy stated that he'd see them all in hell. While the three men's families were relieved with justice being served, they told the media that the crimes underscored the importance of eradicating the Hells Angels from the grassroots level. They argued that Hall was one of several strong armors in the biker gang, who'd grown to believe that he was untouchable. Speaking of untouchable, Maurice Boucher believed he was above the law. That's probably why prosecutors charged him with everything they had, guaranteeing that he'd never see the light of day again. Maurice Boucher.
Boucher was the head of an elite chapter of the Hells Angels. Everyone knew Mum Boucher was a killer, and he knew everyone knew. He seemed to love it.
The Canadian chapter of the Hells Angels has seen several notorious leaders emerge over the years, but none as powerful and dangerous as Maurice Boucher. Born in 1953, Maurice's road to becoming a criminal ringleader and a man feared by all of Canada started off relatively uneventfully. While he might have gotten in trouble a few times in his youth, things took a drastic turn for the first time in 1973 when he was convicted of assault. While serving time for the assault, Maurice met and befriended several members of the Hells Angels. At the time, the American outlaw biker gang had only just begun operations in Canada with only a handful of members. They were trying to dismantle Canada's outlaws biker gang to become the strongest group in the country. They were looking for recruits, and with Maurice's stature, they knew he would be the perfect fit. In 1984, following his release from prison, Maurice transitioned to the Hells Angels, aligning with the organization's expansion into Quebec. Within a relatively short period, Maurice became one of the Hells Angels' strongest members. He quickly rose through the ranks and established himself as the president of the Nomads chapter, a chapter he had also founded. The Nomads chapter was created exclusively to serve as henchmen for the Quebec chapter, or be loaned out to the mafia whenever they needed more men. Under Maurice's leadership, the Hells Angels sought to dominate Quebec's drug trade, igniting the infamous Quebec biker war against rival gangs, notably the Rock Machine. This violent conflict, spanning from 1994 to 2002, resulted in over 150 unalivings, some rival bikers, some members of the Hells Angels themselves, and several innocent bystanders. But it wasn't those 150 slayings that led to Maurice's 2002 conviction. No, it was an event in 1997 when he'd ordered the assassination of two Quebec correctional officers, Diane Levine and Pierre Rondeau. You're probably wondering what either of them could have done to make an enemy out of Maurice. Apparently, they were selected entirely at random by the mobster. That's right, with the turf war against the Rock Machine growing stronger and stronger, Maurice wanted to send a message to law enforcement agencies who were chiefly focused on dismantling the Hells Angels. At the time, the Canadian chapter had grown weaker, with several members either leaving the group, being locked up, or slain. By ordering the hit, Maurice wanted to accomplish two things. One, he wanted to showcase the Hells Angels' strength in the greater Canadian region, and two, he wanted law officials to back off. He also wanted to keep prosecutors from attempting to turn bikers into informants. Maurice believed that these random assassinations would be enough to dismantle the justice system, but he was wrong. Diane Levine was fatally shot on June 26, 1997, while Pierre Rondeau was ambushed on September 8, 1997. Initially, in 1998, Boucher was acquitted of these murders, a verdict that shocked the public and law enforcement. However, persistent efforts by prosecutors led to a retrial in 2002. 3 people were instrumental in Maurice receiving a life sentence. The Crown's prosecutor, France Charbonneau, who remained persistent despite the threats she'd been receiving from the Hells Angels, and ironically enough, 2 members of Maurice's club who were willing to turn on him for immunity. One of them was Stéphane Gagne, nicknamed Goose, who claimed that he was the one who had slain the 2 correctional officers on Maurice's orders. He claimed that not only did Maurice order the attack, but he congratulated Gagne after the fact too. The other member was Serge Boutin. In Boutin's case, he was facing a life sentence of his own when he shot a police informant who'd been wearing a wire at the time. His attorneys worked out a deal with the Crown, promising that Boutin would testify against Maurice if they spared him a life behind bars. The Crown agreed since it was Maurice they were really after. Danny Kane, a member of the Nomads who'd since become a police informant, had stolen a briefcase of financial documents that showed Maurice's involvement in Canada's burgeoning drug scene. This piled onto Maurice's manslaughter charges, with the prosecution arguing that the only possible punishment here was a life behind bars. After 11 days of deliberation by the jury, Maurice was finally found guilty of 1 count of attempted slaying and 2 counts of first-degree unaliving. Reportedly, Maurice only showed emotion as his verdict was being read, a slight frown. Besides that, he'd remained emotionless throughout the trial. The Nomads chapter president received an automatic life sentence with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. After his conviction, Maurice was replaced by Jacques Israel Emond as the new Quebec Hells Angels leader. The Hells Angels, post-Boucher's imprisonment, underwent a period of restructuring. The leadership distanced itself from overt violent displays, opting for a lower profile to reduce public and police attention. This strategic shift allowed the organization to continue its operations with less interference, focusing on consolidating its control over illicit markets. Incarcerated at the Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines institution, Canada's only super maximum security prison, Maurice's influence within the Hells Angels began to go down day by day. The organization, aiming to distance itself from law enforcement, going after them for what Maurice's violent and senseless tactics had attracted, denounced his membership after his conviction. Still, despite being behind bars, Maurice continued to engage in criminal activities. As late as 2015, he was implicated in a plot to unalive Reynald Desjardins, a prominent mafia leader, all the while being locked up himself. The plan was foiled, and Maurice eventually pleaded guilty to the conspiracy charge in 2018 and received an additional 10 years on his life sentence. Frankly, the mobster's criminal activities could have continued for several more years, even while he was in a supermax prison. But then, in 2022, Maurice's health began deteriorating. He was diagnosed with throat cancer and shifted to the prison's hospital, later to the Archambault institution, a facility equipped to provide end-of-life care. There was no cure, and Maurice Boucher passed away on July 10, 2022, at the age of 69. His death marked the end of a violent chapter in Quebec's history. There isn't much redemption for a Hells Angels member, even after they leave the biker gang. However, Chuck Zito proved that there might be a few good eggs still left. Chuck Zito.
Now, while you were locked up and you were having other Hells Angels cooperate
Yes.
against you,
Yes.
were you offered a deal? Hey, cooperate and we'll make all this go away?
You know what? And me, back in the day, trying to be a tough guy and everything, he offered me a year. He offered me a year.
Did you know that Hollywood stuntman and actor Chuck Zito drew from his real-world experience of being a member of the Hells Angels for his role as the enforcer on HBO's Oz? That's a great piece of trivia, almost as great as the fact that Zito could have been spending the rest of his life in prison if he didn't straighten his life out after only serving a decade locked up. Zito's childhood was relatively uneventful. He was the son of Italian immigrants from a working-class family, with a father and several uncles who had trained to become professional wrestlers. Zito himself was in training to become a professional wrestler, but ultimately left that dream behind when he joined the Hells Angels, a move that also cost him his marriage. Throughout the years, Zito became the New York chapter's president and was on the police's radar for several crimes. One of those crimes was attempted unaliving. As part of the New York chapter's initiation process, members had to either unalive or attempt to unalive anyone at random. Zito chose Robert Giangara, a pizzeria owner and low-level mobster who had previously shot and injured Hells Angels biker Cortland Chip Kando in a Manhattan bar. Zito used a remote-controlled device from a model airplane to detonate explosives attached to a vehicle belonging to Giangara. But he survived without serious injuries. The police were unable to locate Giangara afterward, and Zito was never charged with the bombing. After serving as a club prospect, he was voted in as a member of the New York City Hells Angels in 1979. From there on until his conviction in 1985, Zito was a person of interest in several crimes that ranged from extortion to arson. However, in 1985, during Operation Rough Rider, Zito was one of several members of the New York chapter arrested for possession with intent to distribute a controlled substance. This wasn't the first time that Zito was arrested for such an offense, but he'd always managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. However, the FBI noted that the Nomads chapter, specifically under Zito's leadership, was formed as a drug front for the Hells Angels clubhouse in New York. In November 1985, a warrant was issued for Zito's arrest on charges of selling 15.8 ounces of methamphetamine in New York State. At the time, Zito was in Japan, and upon learning of the warrant, he and fellow Hells Angel Herbert Kittle surrendered to the United States Embassy in Tokyo on July 22, 1985. After 4 months of detention in Tokyo, they were extradited to the United States in October 1985. Following 14 months at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, Zito accepted a plea deal in late 1986, pleading guilty to one felony count of drug conspiracy, resulting in a 10-year prison sentence. This sentence was later reduced to 7 years upon appeal in 1988, and Zito ultimately served 6 years across 19 different federal prisons before his release in 1991. Interestingly, Zito maintained his innocence, claiming that despite the stereotype, he was one of the very few members of the Hells Angels who'd never engaged in drug use and would never distribute either. Zito claimed that the feds were only looking to make an example out of him, alleging that they'd promised him immunity in exchange for turning on other members of the New York chapter. In an interview since his release and resignation from the Hells Angels, Zito claimed that prosecutors told him that they would reduce his sentence from 10 years to 1 year if he complied. Zito stated that he would rather spend the decade locked up than turn on the club. Zito also claimed that Operation Rough Rider was uneventful and that the only piece of evidence that the feds had tying him to any crime was an alleged phone call. Zito claimed that the phone call, in which someone can be heard arranging for a drug drop-off, was fabricated by the FBI to indict him on greater charges. Additionally, because he'd just refused to comply with law officials, Zito claimed that they threatened him with a life behind bars. However, the Hollywood stuntman eventually made parole. While Zito did turn his life around and started working professionally as an actor, stuntman, and ringside commentator for boxing matches, he officially left the Hells Angels in 2004. Zito left on good terms, apparently, with the option of returning whenever he was ready. At the time, Zito claimed that he wanted to focus chiefly on becoming an actor. As far as his time in the Hells Angels is concerned, Zito maintained that the club was given a bad reputation, with only a few outliers who'd commit violent crimes. Next up, we're taking a look at one of the most famous, if not the absolute most famous members of the Hells Angel to date. It was every prosecutor's worst nightmare to go up against Sonny Barger, and here's why.
One of the most complex criminal trials in American history is underway in San Francisco. The defendants are all members of the Hells Angel motorcycle gang, but the real contest is over the government's RICO law, or Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization statute. That's a new law designed to give federal law enforcement officials new powers in investigating and acting against organized crime. The San Francisco test case against the Hells Angels is entering its 8th month. The judge hearing the case at one point collapsed on the bench from apparent exhaustion. Court costs are expected to run into the millions.
In the history of the Hells Angels, there's hardly been a member more notorious than Sonny Barger, the founding member of the Hells Angels. Sonny Barger, 38, Barger emerged as a central figure in the outlaw biking culture long before he established the Hells Angels. Barger had a difficult upbringing and eventually dropped out of school in the 10th grade. He would later join the army after falsifying his birth certificate, claiming he was 18 when he was only 16. The Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels was started by Barger in 1957 to band together Oakland bikers. Barger was the perfect candidate for the club's first president because of his charisma. The Oakland chapter proved to be one of the most notable clubs of the Hells Angels, unifying several clubs across the state and expanding the club's influence throughout the United States. However, his tenure wasn't without controversy. Barger faced multiple legal challenges, including arrests for drug possession and assault. This was only the beginning of the Hells Angels' long battle with law enforcement. The feds were on Barger's tail. They wanted to make an example out of him. They wanted to showcase that Barger and other outlaw bikers couldn't get away with running their criminal operations. A case that particularly raised alarm for the feds occurred in 1987 when he, along with 9 other members of the Hells Angels from California and Alaska, was indicted on charges of conspiring to transport firearms and explosives across state lines. The prosecution alleged that the group planned to bomb several clubhouses of their rivals, outlaws. This was in retaliation for the slaying of a Hells Angel member. In 1988, the trial against Barger started with the prosecution urging for a life sentence. The case was a sensation in Louisville, Kentucky, drawing considerable attention with numerous Hells Angels members attending in solidarity and heightened security measures implemented throughout the proceedings. The feds had more than enough for their case. They had Anthony Tate, a former member of the Hells Angel who turned into a government informant. Barger's attorneys were blindsided with Tate's testimony that provided critical insights into the club's internal operations and alleged criminal activities. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Barger guilty of conspiracy to transport and receive explosives with intent to either harm people or damage property. That being said, prosecutors didn't get the life imprisonment conviction that they'd hoped for. If anything, Barger got away with 57 months in federal prison and a considerable fine. Barger was released from prison in 1992 after serving approximately 3.5 years. During this time, the feds and prosecutors tried to indict Barger and the Hells Angels on more charges. Barger was locked up, but that didn't mean that his influence was any less on the inside than it was on the outside. Throughout his incarceration, Barger remained a prominent figure within the outlaw group. He continued to run the day-to-day operations and even recruited members from within the federal prison. On more than a few instances, prosecutors tried to levy more charges against him, but failed to make any claim stick. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the government attempted to prosecute the club under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as the RICO Act, aiming to classify the Hells Angels as a criminal organization. However, these efforts faced significant challenges. In 1980, Barger was acquitted on a racketeering charge, and a mistrial was declared on a conspiracy charge to violate the racketeering law, highlighting the difficulties in securing a conviction against him. Sonny Barger remains a controversial figure long after his passing. To his supporters and fellow Hells Angels members, he was a legend. Barger was a symbol of rebellion, freedom, and brotherhood. He was the Hells Angels' charismatic leader and helped improve their image. Then again, to law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and critics, he represented something a lot more sinister than that. They argued that Barger was a symbol of budding organized crime, motorcycle gangs, and using muscle to strong-arm the public and public institutions. Maybe the only silver lining in the case against Richard DeVries was that it forced Nevada's Supreme Court to file a landmark ruling that ended the Hells Angels' immunity once and for all. Richard DeVries.
Another story we're closely following. The leader of Hells Angels motorcycle gang has been rearrested. Richard DeVries was taken into custody at CCDC today, facing charges including conspiracy to commit murder and more than 20 counts of shooting at an occupied vehicle. This comes after a shootout between rival biker gangs on the 95 back in May. 7 people were hurt. DeVries and his co-defendants are due back in court on Thursday.
And last but not least, we have Richard DeVries, who is the president of the Las Vegas chapter of the Hells Angels. He's been a central figure in several high-profile criminal incidents since joining the Hells Angels, a person of interest in a number of crimes, and all of that came to a head in 2022. DeVries has been able to avoid law officials for the longest time, but it looks like his luck has run out and he might be spending the rest of his life locked up. On May 29, 2022, a violent confrontation erupted on Interstate 11 near Henderson, Nevada, involving members of the Hells Angels and the rival Vagos Motorcycle Club. The altercation, which occurred after a Memorial Day weekend event at a veterans cemetery in Boulder City, escalated into a shooting that left 7 individuals injured, 6 of whom were identified as Vagos members. Authorities allege that DeVries, along with fellow Hells Angels members Stephen Alo and Russell Smith, orchestrated the ambush. The trio was subsequently arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including attempted slaying, conspiracy to commit a slaying, battery with a weapon, and discharging a firearm into an occupied vehicle. The arrest signified something more than just arresting a notable member of the Las Vegas chapter. Prosecutors wanted to strengthen their case, closing down the entire chapter altogether. The only way to dismantle such a large faction of the Hells Angels was to lock up DeVries for good. Prosecutors started working on an ironclad case against him, one that would guarantee a life term. This could only be achieved by filing racketeering charges against him. As is the case with many Hells Angels members and prosecutors' attempts to keep them locked up for the rest of their lives, DeVries went away scot-free. Prosecutors wanted to use DeVries as an example in a landmark decision to change Nevada law, classifying the Hells Angels as a criminal organization in the state. However, in May 2023, a Las Vegas judge dismissed the racketeering charges against DeVries and his co-defendants, citing insufficient evidence to substantiate the claims of organized criminal conduct. Still, prosecutors managed to do something. In December 2024, the Nevada Supreme Court issued a ruling that officially recognized the Hells Angels as a criminal gang under state law.